I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, when the home you love doesn't love you back. In a new podcast episode, former First Coast Connect host Al Letson chronicles his return to his hometown of Jacksonville at a time of escalating racial discord and danger. This morning, we're delighted to welcome back to the program our favorite poet, playwright, performer, and podcaster, Al Letson. Hey, Al.
Hey, how you doing?
It's great. We're doing great, and it's great to hear from you. For our listeners who need to know what you've been doing since you vacated the big chair here at First Coast Connect, what are you working on?
I'm still hosting Reveal, which is on WJCT. I think we come on Saturdays. But yeah, I'm still hosting Reveal. Going on my 10th year doing that. And I am currently writing for a television show that I cannot tell the name of. But it's a good show, and yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Terrific. Well, we're glad to have you back. I sure you're missing some of your pals here at WJCT, and I know that we all miss you a lot.
I can't tell you how much I miss you guys. I don't miss the early mornings, but I miss WJCT and everybody there. It's my home.
Well, it's extra early for you out there on the West Coast, so thanks for it. We're going to get into one of your recent projects here because it involves Jacksonville.
Yeah.
I want to get you some breaking news now out of Jacksonville. A shooting there on the city's west side has now resulted in, quote, a number of fatalities. That's according to Jacksonville Mayor
August 26, 2023. A white supremacist murders 3 black people at a Dollar General in Jacksonville. By now, many people won't even remember it. It's just another day, another mass shooting. Time can move so fast. But for me, that day, I can't let it go.
Al, you were having to cover this story as it happened here in Jacksonville. If you're comfortable talking about it, explain what it's like to be functioning as a journalist and a person of color when covering racist violence like this.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's, it cuts a bunch of ways, right? Because not only was I covering it, and not only was it a, racist attack that was aimed, at killing black people, but also striking fear throughout black people in the First Coast. Jacksonville's my home. It's the place that I go to, get away from the craziness of all the other things that I'm doing. It feels, Jacksonville to me, every time I come home, it feels like a warm hug. It feels like, oh God. And so, to have the place that feels sacred to me be violated in this way. And the thing is that, like, I'm not naive or Pollyanna about Jacksonville. Like, I've recognized that the city can be a very violent place, especially, depending on where you live, like, kind of dictates how much violence you'll see. But, I think that, like, a shooter with a racist manifesto that literally is pointed at black people, it felt different to me. And so, yeah, it was a lot covering all of that stuff and talking to people who are directly affected by it.
And you've worked for the investigative podcast Reveal for like a decade now, and you've tackled a lot of really difficult subjects, including race. And I'm thinking particularly of that Mississippi, I can't say the word, series, in the name of a Nina Simone song, right? But in it, you report on the murder of Billy Joe Johnson, a Mississippi teen who was killed while dating a white girl. What was different about being in Jacksonville, your home, when you were? Yeah.
It's a little, like, actually the reason why I fell into reporting Mississippi GD, which was like a long time investigation. Like, I think I heard about Billy Joe's death 10 years before. I mean, I reported a little bit on Billy Joe's death 10 years before that series came out, and so we worked on it for like 3 years in earnest. But I think what drew me to that story was that Billy's story reminded me of growing up in Clay County in Orange Park, and some of the things that I had to deal with as a young man at his age, and things that other young Black people were dealing with in Clay County back then. So so really, like, there was a lot of parallels in that investigation that kind of made me want to do it. So I think, though, that, like, when it comes to the shooting and, dealing with that, one of the things I talk about in that hour that we did is that, I've dealt with a lot of racism in Jacksonville before. I mean, I give you so many stories and little incidents that happened to me growing up in Jacksonville. So for me, like, it wasn't like the shooting was a big surprise. It was more like feeling that even though I've dealt with this before in Jacksonville, that something feels different lately. Like it's moving, like the temperature is rising in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so that was the thing that I was trying to reflect in the reporting.
Yeah, and it's something that you actually don't shy away from in the episode. Let's listen to a little of that.
Sure.
The emotion here in this predominantly African-American community is still pretty raw. Some people are fearful, a lot of people are angry, and many people feel as if their community here in Jacksonville is being terrorized.
This tragedy is a deadly manifestation of a growing problem in the state. Like I said, I've seen my share of racism and hatred in Florida, but what's been happening recently, it feels different, more targeted, more intense. In the past, I've always had clarity. There were places and parts of town I just didn't go to because I knew I wasn't welcome there. But when a racist mass shooter drives to a Black neighborhood to kill Black people, or when Nazis show up at Disney World, whatever clarity I had is gone. There's nowhere that's safe. I want to understand what's driving this change, because this is my city, my state, my heart.
Some beautiful writing there, Al. At what point did you decide that you would want to do a podcast episode on this incident, and did you have any reservations about doing it?
Yeah, I decided probably, we were thinking about, Reveal was thinking about doing an episode on Florida for a bit, just because, Ron DeSantis at the time was in the presidential race, and I had been hearing a lot of rumbling about what was going on in Jacksonville schools. And that was before I came out to be at home for the summer and host First Coast Connect. So when I got here and I started talking to a lot of friends who were teachers, and I started seeing what was happening, around the city, then I started thinking, well, that's the story I think that I want to tell. And as we're doing this and we're collecting all the data and the stories about, the rising tide of extremism here, I mean, like, literally, like, I'm right in the middle of, researching this stuff and talking to people, the mass shooting happened. And so for me, it felt like, when you're telling a story, you're always, like, trying to think about, like, what's your way in and how you're going to wrap it up. At least I do. And so to me, the shooting, it felt like a good way into a story that was already developing. So that's kind of how we jumped on it. But prior to, the shooting, I had already decided that we were going to do, like, some stories on Florida and what was going on. It just came into focus with the shooting.
We're talking to Al Letson about his latest podcast episode on race in the Sunshine State. It's called Black in the Sunshine State. Just ahead, we're going to talk about the impact of a massive fire on downtown development, so stick around for that. But we want to hear from you. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram, or tag us on X at FCC On Air. We have a call. Stanley, good morning, Stanley. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning. This is African History Month. And also, first, and you do a fantastic job. I'm very impressed with you. But I have an issue that I must address. And the issue is, I'm an African American. I'm not people of color. Now, some African Americans go with that, but that's racist. People of color, we are Africans, or we are African American, or we Black. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Stanley. I think that the distinction being made these days, not to contradict, but I mean, there are people in this country that aren't of African descent, that are people of color. And I apologize if that phrase is not amenable. Al, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that everybody's got their different things that they like and dislike. And I haven't heard Stanley's voice forever. Stanley, how you doing, man? I would say I don't think it's me personally. I don't think it's racist to call black people of color. I identify as black, but I don't get offended when people say people of color.
So, Al, you incorporate some of the interviews that you did on the air at while you were here at First Coast Connect. I don't remember if Stanley specifically was one of them, but you also incorporated media coverage at the time, and you did some new interviews as well, including with Republican lawmaker Randy Fine. Why did you seek him out in particular?
Well, Randy Fine had been DeSantis' lieutenant in all of these bills that DeSantis put out, and specifically like with the Stop Woke Act and some other things. And so I felt like Ron DeSantis wouldn't talk to me for this story, and if Ron wouldn't talk to me, I felt like the next person to talk to would be his lieutenant, which, and I think Randy Fine is, I think he's an interesting character in the sense that he's pushing this legislation that, really a lot of, from my understanding of the legislation is that it feels like it is targeting African Americans and African American history. And yet on the flip side, like, he's a Jewish man and he wants to protect Jewish history. And so for me, like, the idea of talking to somebody like that and really trying to get to understand them was important.
You had a pretty healthy back and forth with him about his decisions that kind of seem contradictory. Like, he is supporting the governor's anti-woke curriculum, which restricts how and when you can teach, what you can teach about racism in America, but also mandating the teaching of a particularly horrific episode of Black history, the Ocoee Massacre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still don't know how to take all of that, because I think that, like, I think that Representative Fine has his own version of history that works specifically for him. It doesn't really work for me, and so that was the question that I had with him: is how do you balance those two things? And I don't think that I got a really satisfying answer from him. But, like, as a journalist, my job is to ask the question and to push him, to push him to get the answer. But, sometimes you don't get the answer you're looking for.
Well, let's hear a little bit of that interview that you did with State Representative Randy Fine.
It didn't say you couldn't teach bad American history. It just said you couldn't teach slavery and then look at somebody like me and say, and you should feel bad about it because it's your fault.
But do you think that that's actually happening in schools, where, like, schools were talking about slavery and then turning to the white kids saying you should feel bad about this?
There were examples of it.
So, Al, what did he provide in the way of examples?
None. None. He at the end of the conversation, his office sent over books that they thought were questionable, and I don't have those books in front of me. I think he said it in the hour, but I don't have them in front of me. But my opinion of those books is that no, they were not. They weren't questionable to me, and I thought it was interesting that the 3 books that he sent us were all written by Black women. So yeah, I don't think that he, in my opinion, made his case on those things.
So in the episode, you trace a broad and compelling arc of history. You're comparing the rewriting, or at least the reshaping of history, to the story of Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville. Explain why you see echoes of that story in the current curriculum battles in Florida.
Well, I think that, like, when it came to Axe Handle Sunday, like, I grew up, I moved to Jacksonville as a kid. Like, I moved to Jacksonville when I was 10 years old. and I lived in Jacksonville, you know, ever since. I mean, I'm still currently, I have a house in Jacksonville. I pay taxes in Jacksonville. Like I still consider myself living in Jacksonville, right? I'm just out here working. But, you know, I was in Jacksonville for a very long time before I even heard about Axe Handle Saturday. And so for me, the idea that, like, that history happened, like, not far from where I grew up in downtown. And it was something that we didn't talk about. I think the first time that I heard about it was when it was, like, I guess the 50th anniversary, maybe. And that may have been the first time I heard about it. And then, like, you know, trying to, I mean, I feel like now it's a lot easier to learn about it because you've got books by, you know, people that were there, like Rodney Hurst and several other accounts that you can, you know, go out and find. But I think back then you didn't have those resources. And so, yeah, it just was kind of, I felt like it was written out of the history, like people didn't want to talk about it. And the mayor of Jacksonville at the time, you know, basically tried to sweep it under the rug and say it never happened. So I think there's a lot of parallels to that and what's happening when it comes to African American history. I think that, you know, like I say at the end of the episode, that what it feels like is that the administration, the DeSantis administration, does not ever want to talk about, like, the hardship that African Americans have had in this state or in this country, but he does want to celebrate. Yeah, but look, you're all good now, and let's celebrate in that. And I think that you can't celebrate everything being all good because everything is not all good, without talking about, like, how we got here.
It was Jelani Cobb was in town here recently, as you might know, and you know one of the things that he said in his you know coverage and research on race is that he sees what's happening today as sort of a reaction to the fact that there has been such progress in terms of recognizing historical wrongs, things like systemic racism, that these are, you know, attempts in a kind of panicked fig leaf way of trying to, you know, rein some of that back in. But that he took a certain amount of, you know, confidence in the fact that that meant it was being effective, that meant it was going to be part of the dialogue going forward, and that it was kind of like the cat's out of the bag, you know?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that, like, you know, whenever you get progress, it's a pendulum. The other side is going to push back against that. Like, nothing is ever. I think, you know, there's a biography on a biopic on Netflix called Rustin. It's about, like, one of my favorite civil rights leaders, Bayard Rustin, and in studying Bayard Rustin, his life and his activism was a series of steps forward and steps back, and steps forward and steps back. And I think that is exactly, like, you know, what we are seeing is that, like, we step forward and then, you know, it pushes back. I think that, you know, a lot of the laws that we're seeing about, like, stopping woke and changing the history, that is, in my opinion, a direct oppositional force against the 1619 Project that came out from the New York Times, that was, you know, headed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, that was really about, like, writing the history of America and really talking about this history that we tend to ignore. You know, with, like, one of the things that I spoke to Nicole Hannah-Jones, and one of the things that she talked about is that, like, we love to talk about this part of history because it feels good to us, but we don't want to talk about that part of history because it doesn't feel good to us. And her point is that, like, you can't talk about one without talking about the other. You have to talk about it all. And I think that that's where we're at, is that, like, you know, all of these laws that, not all of them, but the laws that DeSantis has put out that is specifically about history and how it's taught, it's a direct swing back against the idea that maybe we haven't been telling the whole story.
Interestingly, I mean, you are able to weave a lot of elements into this podcast episode, you know, that kind of starts with the shooting as its main focus, but then you have all these tendrils that connect to it. And one of the things that you explore are the connections to the issue of Black representation writ large. Former U.S. Congresswoman from Florida, Carrie Meek, is a big part of that. Can you just remind us who she is and why her election was significant at the time?
Yeah, so there had not been a Black representative in Florida for 100 years after Reconstruction, and or something like close to 100 years. And so when the Florida legislature passed a law basically saying that, Black people need representation. They need somebody from their community to represent their community, and Meek won that election. And so it'd been, a very long time since we've had Black representation in the Florida legislature. So her election was huge and monumental. And it's like, I think that her election is indicative of like what DeSantis is trying to do, in the sense that DeSantis probably wouldn't have a problem talking about Representative Meeks winning that election, but he wouldn't want to talk about the fact that it took 100 years to get there, right? And so to me, it's just like you can't talk about one without the other, because if you lose one, you ultimately lose what makes the other important, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And you say in the podcast episode, there was almost 2 million Black Floridians at the time that she was elected, but that the state hadn't had a Black representative in Congress for 100 years, not since,
Reconstruction, yeah.
Yeah. And it was really immediately after slavery that her predecessor was elected. So it's just an astonishing lack of representation, which is perhaps not shocking, but still kind of a surprise, I think, when people realize that long period without any Black representative happened.
Yeah. It's I think that's why history is so important, so that we can look back and really understand what happened in the past, because it gives context today.
There, Al?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just saying that, like, I think that's why the past is so important, because it gives context to today.
In this segment, you also, tackle a difficult topic, one that you also covered a lot while you were at First Coast Connect, which is the issue of the Confederate monuments. And that's an issue that has lingered for a long time, with kind of fits and starts over time. But you look to this removal that finally happened after you left, and with a little bit of hope. Let's hear from just a little bit from the podcast.
Being at home in Jacksonville, watching all of this play out, from the rise of extremism to changes in education to redistricting efforts, it's a lot. And yet, folks in the Black community and the allies I've talked to were steadfast and believed that change was possible. And I gotta be honest with you, I wasn't so sure. But a couple weeks ago, something happened.
I think it's gonna happen.
The last monument to the Confederacy in Jacksonville came down.
Oh, yes.
So do you feel hopeful, Al? I mean, when I listen to that, it sounds sort of like a hopeful note that you choose to end on.
I'm not hopeful. But I am, I believe that change can happen. And I believe that the only way that change happens is if people, like the people that fought, the activists that fought to get it torn down, the mayor who was courageous in bringing it down. Like, I think that is how change happens. And it's amazing that, like, just like everywhere else in the world, that there are people who are willing to sacrifice and put their names, livelihood, and safety on the line to stand up for what's right. And I think that is a beautiful thing. Am I hopeful about the direction that Florida is going? I'm not. I think that I think that everything moves in a pendulum, and I think that honestly, like, we have been and we will continue to be in a challenging space for a good little bit, and I think ultimately it'll come back around. But I don't know how long it will be until it comes back around, and I don't know how many lives will be affected until it comes back around. And so I do think that, like, it's not, I made this episode because I love Jacksonville. Like, I love it. It's my home. I get frustrated with it all the time, but I love it, love it, love it. And I feel like the only way that you move forward is whether, I feel like moving forward with pessimism isn't exactly the strongest way you can move forward. I think, you have to move forward with some idea that things can change, and I absolutely believe things can change. I think the thing that I'm thinking about a lot is that, like, I believe things can change, but who gets left behind in the meantime, and who gets hurt in the meantime?
I'm curious, since you left, the sheriff's office wrapped its investigation and released the racist manifesto that the shooter in this awful tragedy at Dollar General wrote. It's kind of unreadable, and some local news outlets chose kind of not to use any of it or to talk about it. They've stopped using his name. But I wonder what your thoughts are about the decision to release that, in part because it's, not just awful racism, but it is a call to action that he's making. And it seems like could be potentially a really dangerous document to distribute.
Yeah, I'm a little conflicted on it, because I think that, like, and on one hand, I think it's important to, cast daylight on the things that have been done, to, like, really talk about what's happened and really get the information out there. On the flip side of that, I think that, these manifestos can be seen and used by people with bad intentions as recruitment tools. And so I would not, far be it from me to tell a news director what they should and shouldn't do with their work. I think that as long as they have, like, really spirited conversations about whether to put it out, and they really thought about it, I think that, whatever decision they made what they thought was best for their organization. So I don't want to, like, cast blame and tell somebody that they shouldn't have put out information, because I know as a journalist, like, those conversations, they're really hard. I'll give you an example. Like, many years ago, like in 2016, I interviewed Richard Spencer, and Richard Spencer at the time was the white supremacist du jour. And he was going on all sorts of programs. But the way he was being framed is that, like, he was a sexy new think tank that had radical ideas. And he was not a sexy new think tank. He was just preaching hate. It's old school hate. There was nothing sexy about it, and there was nothing new about it. But he had the sheen that he was doing something new. And so for me, the reason why we interviewed him is to pull the mask off and to show people exactly who he is. And I think on a whole, we were successful with that. 3 years later, I had the opportunity to talk to him again, and we did, but we were very smart and targeted about how we talked to him and what we included in the interview that we let out. Because I realized that at that point in his career, the damage had already been done to him, and any other publicity I gave to him was just that. It was publicity. It was good for him no matter what. And so it was like thinking about, like, when and where you use those type of things. So you are getting out information and not necessarily helping his racist cause. It was a big conversation that we had in the newsroom, and it took a really long time for us to strike the balance that felt right for everybody in the newsroom. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to news organizations and reporting these things with these manifestos and so forth and so on, that you just have to have a spirited debate where everybody's really honest, like, how they see the world, and figure out that fine line to put it out. I do not want to be the person who is the arbiter of all things right. I'm just saying that that's the way we went about it.
I mean, that also speaks to why it's so important to have diverse newsrooms, diversity in the newsroom.
Absolutely.
Well, Al Letson,
Absolutely.
we are so happy to get in touch with you again, and we appreciate you waking up extra early to talk to us. But stay in touch. Keep us, abreast of your ongoing projects so we can touch base again soon.
I would love to. I love you guys. I miss you guys. And I'm so glad you're in the big chair doing such a great job. I listen on the podcast. Good job. Good job.
Al, thank you. We'll be back in just a minute.